Welcome to Spicy Family Scandals, where real-life drama meets hard-earned wisdom. Today's story is about betrayal, resilience, and the power of standing up for yourself. Let's dive in.
The sound of the front door slamming shut echoed through the house, but it was the laughter that cut me the deepest. Jason's low chuckle mixed with Megan's sharp cackle as their voices faded into the night. I sat frozen in the dining room, staring at the wine glass in my hand, the stem trembling between my fingers. It wasn't the fight that left me reeling, it was the way they looked at each other, as if I were some kind of joke they'd been sharing for years. "Did you see her face?" Megan had sneered as they walked out. Priceless. That wasn't the first time she'd humiliated me. Megan, Jason's golden child of a sister, had always found ways to undermine me at family gatherings. From sly digs about my cooking to passive-aggressive comments about my career, she thrived on cutting me down. But tonight, something shifted. It wasn't just her cruel words. It was Jason's silent approval, his complicity in my humiliation. I replayed the scene in my head. Megan standing in the kitchen, arms crossed, her lips curling into a satisfied smirk as she declared I was too soft to handle this family. And Jason, leaning casually against the counter, didn't even blink. He didn't defend me. He didn't speak up. Instead, he let her twist the knife. And that smirk on his face, it was like watching a stranger wear the mask of the man I thought I knew. I set the wineglass down carefully, the sharp edge of betrayal slicing through my chest. The warmth I'd once felt for Jason, the love, the trust, froze into something unrecognizable. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even anger. It was clarity. I went upstairs, the house eerily quiet now, and opened his desk drawer. Jason was predictable, almost painfully so. I rifled through papers, receipts, and junk until I found it, his backup phone. He didn't know I knew about it. Just for work, he'd said once when I'd asked about the second number that popped up on our phone bill. I hadn't pushed it then. I wish I had. The screen lit up, and my stomach flipped as I scanned through the messages. Megan's name was at the top of the list. The thread was long, and I didn't have the stomach to read everything, but what I did see was enough to confirm what I'd feared. This wasn't just sibling loyalty. This was something darker, more twisted. Megan wasn't just his sister, she was his partner in sabotage. Words like, "she's falling for it," and "wait until tomorrow" jumped out at me. There were mentions of money, property, and even cryptic references to meetings I hadn't known about. My hands shook as I pieced it together. They weren't just trying to undermine me emotionally, they were plotting something far bigger. I dropped the phone onto the desk, my heart pounding. Whatever they had planned, they'd underestimated me. They thought I was weak, blind, too trusting to notice the web they were spinning around me. They were wrong. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the dark, my mind racing, calculating. By the time the sun rose, I knew exactly what I needed to do. The next morning, I went through my usual motions: shower, coffee, toast, but every movement felt detached, mechanical. My mind buzzed with the knowledge of what I'd uncovered, replaying those text messages over and over, trying to piece together their endgame. Jason came down the stairs, acting like nothing had happened, offering me his usual tight smile and a casual morning. I matched his energy, playing my part. "Morning," I said, keeping my tone even. Inside, though, I was seething. He leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee, scrolling through his phone. He didn't notice my eyes lingering on him a second too long, watching his every move. It struck me how normal he looked, like any other husband starting his day. How many mornings like this had I shared with him, oblivious to the cracks forming beneath the surface. When he left for work, I didn't cry. I didn't scream or throw anything. Instead, I called my best friend, Angela. She picked up on the first ring, her voice laced with concern before I even said a word. "What's wrong?" I told her everything. The fight with Megan, the texts I'd found, Jason's cold indifference. Angela didn't interrupt, didn't gasp or offer cliches. When I finally finished, there was a pause before she said, "You know this goes deeper than you think, right? Jason's not just enabling her, he's using her." Her words hit like a slap. Of course, Jason wasn't just Megan's pawn. He was orchestrating this. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right there in front of me. Angela's voice softened. You need to protect yourself, Liv. Financially, legally. And you need proof. Proof. The words settled into my chest like a weight. I didn't want to just catch them. I wanted to dismantle whatever they were plotting, expose their lies, and leave them scrambling. That afternoon, while Jason was at work, I dug deeper. I started with his emails. Jason wasn't stupid, but he was arrogant. He never expected me to look. It took me less than an hour to find what I needed. Buried in an old email thread were references to a transfer involving Megan and a property I didn't even know we owned, a vacation cabin upstate. Apparently, Jason had quietly added Megan's name to the deed months ago. I didn't stop there. I searched our joint accounts, combed through transaction histories, and uncovered multiple cash withdrawals, large ones, over the past year. They were deliberate, spaced apart just enough to avoid suspicion. The funds were being funneled somewhere, likely to Megan. My hands shook, but I kept going. By the time Jason walked through the door that evening, I had a folder filled with screenshots, bank statements, and emails. But I wasn't ready to confront him yet, not directly. Not until I was sure he couldn't wiggle his way out. Hey, he said casually, dropping his keys on the counter. How was your day? Fine, I said, forcing a smile. Yours? Busy. Same as usual. He kissed me on the cheek, his face a perfect mask of normalcy. It made my stomach churn. The game was on, but he didn't know I was playing yet. That night, as he slept soundly beside me, I slipped out of bed and made 2 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer Angela had recommended, someone discreet who specialized in cases exactly like this. The second was to a private investigator. I needed someone to dig deeper, someone who could follow Jason and Megan's movements while I kept up the facade of being the clueless wife. When I crawled back into bed, Jason stirred slightly, his arm draping over my waist. I lay stiff as a board, staring at the ceiling, the cold weight of his betrayal pressing against me. He had no idea what was coming. The next few days were a masterclass in acting. I smiled when Jason cracked a joke, nodded at his mundane stories from work, and played the dutiful wife. Beneath the surface, though, I was calculating every move, waiting for the right moment to push my plan into motion. The private investigator, a man named Drew, was worth every penny. By day 3, he had delivered a preliminary report. Jason and Megan were meeting regularly at a small cafe on the other side of town, far enough from our neighborhood to avoid running into anyone we knew. Drew had also traced a significant portion of the withdrawn money. Jason had opened a separate account in his name, but Megan had full access to it. My blood boiled as I flipped through the photos of them laughing together at the cafe. Whatever they were plotting, they didn't even bother hiding it anymore. But the biggest bombshell came later that evening when Drew called me personally. You might want to sit down for this, he said, his voice steady but charged with urgency. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, dread pooling in my stomach. What is it? I did some digging into that property upstate, Drew said. It's already in Megan's name. Fully transferred. But here's the kicker. Your husband's filed paperwork to sell your primary residence. It's not finalized yet, but it's in motion. My breath caught in my throat. Our home. The place where I'd poured years of effort, love, and care. He was planning to sell it out from under me. Worse, he hadn't even had the decency to tell me. Drew continued. If I had to guess, he's setting up Megan to take everything. Between the accounts, the properties, and the sale of your house, he's leaving you with nothing. It felt like the ground beneath me had split open. For a moment, I was frozen, torn between heartbreak and fury. But then, that cold clarity returned. If Jason wanted war, I'd give it to him, and I wouldn't lose. The next morning, I packed a small bag under the pretense of visiting Angela. Girls' night, I told Jason as I kissed him goodbye. He seemed distracted, muttering something about a late meeting at work. His indifference was almost insulting. Instead of heading to Angela's, I went straight to the lawyer's office. He was a sharp, no-nonsense man named Frank who immediately grasped the stakes. By the time I left, we had a plan. A motion to freeze all joint assets and a petition to block the sale of the house. Frank assured me we could stall the process long enough to uncover any hidden accounts or deals Jason had made. Next, I paid a visit to the bank where Jason had opened his secret account. Armed with the documentation Drew had provided, I requested an immediate freeze on the funds. The banker hesitated at first, but eventually complied when I mentioned pending legal action. When I got home that evening, Jason was already there, scrolling through his phone on the couch. He didn't even look up as I walked in. "Have fun?" he asked absently. "Always," I said with a smile that felt razor-sharp. The following morning, everything began to unravel for Jason. His phone buzzed relentlessly as he sat at the breakfast table. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, savoring the confusion that flickered across his face. He frowned, muttering under his breath as he tapped at the screen. "What's wrong?" I asked, feigning concern. "Nothing," he snapped, but his tone betrayed him. By noon, Megan was at our door. She stormed into the house, her face flushed with anger. "What the hell is going on?" she hissed at Jason, completely ignoring me. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to busy myself with dishes, but my ears were sharp. Megan's voice carried through the house. "The account's frozen. The transfer's blocked. Do you know how much trouble this is going to cause?" Jason's voice dropped, too low for me to catch the words, but the tension in the air was palpable. Whatever plan they'd cooked up was crumbling, and I wasn't done yet. When Megan finally stormed out, slamming the door behind her, Jason came into the kitchen. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "We need to talk," he said, his voice clipped. I turned to face him, my expression calm. "Oh, do we?" For the first time, he looked unsure of himself. "I don't know what's going on, but we need to figure this out together." I stepped closer, tilting my head as I studied him. "You mean like partners?" I said, my voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Because that's funny, Jason. I thought we were partners until I found out about Megan, and the cabin, and the account, and the house." His face went slack, the color draining from his cheeks. For the first time, Jason realized just how much I knew. Jason stared at me, his expression frozen somewhere between panic and anger. For a long moment, the kitchen was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I could almost hear his mind working, scrambling for an explanation, a way to regain control of the situation. But he'd underestimated me for far too long, and now, the game was mine. "What are you talking about?" he finally asked, his voice low, almost threatening. I didn't flinch. Instead, I smiled, a small, calculated curve of my lips. "Oh, come on, Jason. You're smarter than that. Or, at least you used to be." I took a step closer, my voice dropping just enough to make him lean in. "I know everything. The cabin, the account, the sale, Megan's little side project. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out?" His eyes darted toward the door, as if Megan might burst back in to rescue him. But she wasn't here, and she wouldn't be. "Liv, you're misunderstanding," he began, but I cut him off. "Save it." My voice was sharp now, slicing through the air like a knife. "I saw the emails, the texts, the paperwork. You've been planning this for months, haven't you? Selling the house, funneling the money to Megan, leaving me with nothing. Were you planning to tell me before or after you handed over the keys?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he went on the offensive. "You've been spying on me," he accused, his tone dripping with indignation. "That's insane, Liv. You're blowing this way out of proportion." I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Blowing it out of proportion? That's rich, Jason. You and Megan have been scheming behind my back, trying to erase me from my own life, and I'm the one overreacting?" I took another step closer, my eyes locking onto his. "Do you even hear yourself?" For a moment he faltered, his gaze shifting to the floor. Then, as if flipping a switch, he straightened, his features hardening into a mask of calculated calm. "Fine," he said coolly. "You want to talk about it? Let's talk." Yes, Megan and I had plans. But do you know why? Because you've been dragging this family down for years. The words hit like a slap, but I didn't let him see it. I crossed my arms, my voice steady despite the fire raging inside me. "Go on," I said, daring him to continue. "You've been so focused on your little struggles, your job, your health, your excuses, that you've forgotten what it means to be part of something bigger. Megan gets it. She actually contributes. And Honestly, Liv, I don't know why I kept trying to make this work with you. The venom in his words was unmistakable, but it was his tone, calm, almost condescending, that ignited something in me. This wasn't just betrayal. This was disdain, the kind that had been simmering under the surface for who knows how long. And suddenly, I realized I didn't need him to admit anything else. I had all the proof I needed. I stepped back, letting the silence stretch between us. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly waiting for me to explode, to cry, to beg him to explain. But I didn't give him the satisfaction. "Is that all?" I asked finally, my tone so calm it unnerved even me. "What do you mean?" he snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I mean, is that the best excuse you've got? Because if you're going to burn everything to the ground, Jason, you should at least have a decent story." I picked up my bag from the counter and slung it over my shoulder. "You know what? Don't bother. I'm done listening to you." "Where are you going?" he demanded, his voice rising. I paused in the doorway, glancing back at him over my shoulder. "You'll find out soon enough," I said. And with that, I walked out, leaving him standing there, stunned and alone. I didn't go far, just down the street to Angela's house. She'd been waiting for my call, and the moment I walked in, she handed me a glass of wine and pulled out her laptop. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked, her expression a mix of concern and determination. I nodded. "I'm more than ready." We spent the next hour combing through every piece of evidence I'd gathered, organizing it into a damning portfolio that painted a clear picture of Jason and Megan's betrayal. Then, with Angela's help, I made the final move. By the time I left her house that evening, the wheels were already in motion. Jason thought he was playing a clever game, but he didn't realize I'd just flipped the board. Jason's unraveling began the next morning. I knew at the moment I saw him pacing the kitchen, his phone clutched tightly in one hand. His usually calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a tautness in his shoulders and a fire in his eyes that told me something had gone very wrong for him. "Is there a reason why the bank froze our accounts?" he asked, his voice sharp, though he tried to keep it steady. I sipped my coffee, leaning casually against the counter. "Our accounts?" I echoed, feigning ignorance. "I'm not sure what you mean." He shot me a glare, his frustration boiling over. "Don't play dumb, Liv. I know you did something. The bank's saying there's a legal hold on everything. Care to explain?" I set my mug down carefully, my movements deliberate. "Well, Jason, it's funny you mention that. I was going through some things recently, bank statements, emails, property deeds, and it seems there are quite a few things you forgot to mention. Like the cabin, or the sale of our house, or the account you opened with Megan." I let each word hang in the air, watching his face darken with every revelation. "You had no right," he began, but I cut him off. "I had every right," I snapped, my voice rising for the first time. "You've been lying to me, Jason. For months. You and your precious sister have been plotting behind my back, trying to take everything I've worked for. So, forgive me if I decided to protect myself before you had the chance to screw me over completely." His face twisted in anger, but there was something else there too. Fear. He knew I wasn't bluffing. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed. "Do you know what this is going to cost us?" "Oh, I know exactly what it's going to cost you," I shot back. "And trust me, Jason, it's only the beginning." That day, I went into full battle mode. The lawyer I'd hired had filed an injunction to block the sale of the house, and I'd made sure Megan's name was flagged on every account Jason had tried to tie her to. The investigator, Drew, had uncovered even more damning evidence, a paper trail of shady transactions that suggested Megan had been siphoning money from Jason's side business, padding her own bank account under the guise of helping the family. The cherry on top? A secret contract between Jason and Megan, promising her a 50% stake in any profits from the sale of our house. It was all so meticulously detailed, so smugly calculated, that I almost had to admire their nerve. Almost. But I wasn't done yet. That evening, Megan showed up at the house again, her face red with fury. She didn't even knock, just stormed in, slamming the door behind her. "This is all your fault," she spat, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You've ruined everything." Jason followed close behind, his face pale but set in determination. "Megan, calm down," he began, but she whirled on him. "Calm down? Are you kidding me, Jason? She's destroying us. You said you had this under control. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching their little meltdown with a detached kind of satisfaction. Oh, don't mind me, I said sweetly. Please continue. I'm dying to hear how this was all supposed to play out. You think this is funny? Megan snapped, her voice shrill. You don't deserve any of it. The house, the money, Jason. You're just some washed-up leech who... That's enough, I said sharply, cutting her off. I straightened, my tone ice-cold. You can call me whatever you want, Megan. But the fact is, you and Jason tried to take everything from me. And now, you're both going to lose. Jason stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Liv, let's just talk about this, okay? We can figure something out. There's nothing to figure out, I said, my voice firm. It's already done. The accounts are frozen. The sale is blocked. And as for you two, I pulled out my phone and held up the photos Drew had sent me, Jason and Megan at their secret meetings, the documents tying them to their scheme. I've got everything I need to make sure neither of you gets a single penny. Megan lunged forward, her face twisted with rage, but Jason grabbed her arm, holding her back. Don't, he warned, his voice low. I took a step closer, locking eyes with Jason. You thought you could break me, but you forgot one thing. I've been through worse. And I'm still standing. With that, I turned on my heel and walked out of the room, leaving them to stew in the mess they'd created. But as I climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet, that Jason and Megan weren't done fighting back. And, honestly, I almost hoped they'd try. The storm didn't take long to return. By the following morning, Jason had gone silent, his usual barrage of defensive excuses replaced by a cold, calculating quiet. Megan, on the other hand, wasn't nearly as composed. She called the house twice, leaving voicemails laced with venom, threats, and thinly veiled desperation. I played each one for Angela over breakfast, the two of us sitting at my kitchen table while Jason sulked in the living room. She's unraveling, Angela said, her lips curling into a small, satisfied smile. They both are. Good, I replied. But deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. Jason and Megan had spent months, maybe years, crafting their scheme. They wouldn't just roll over because I'd thrown a wrench in their plans. Later that day, a package arrived at the house. It was addressed to Jason, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it carefully, revealing a stack of glossy brochures for a luxury condo development, ones I hadn't seen before. Each page was filled with promises of opulence and exclusivity, and in bold letters across the front, I saw the name Megan Foster Realty. I stared at the name, the pieces clicking together. Megan wasn't just trying to take what was mine. She was leveraging it. The cabin, the house, the money. It was all part of her pitch to potential investors, proof of her success in the real estate world. Jason wasn't just complicit. He was actively feeding her empire, building her credibility with assets that weren't hers to begin with. Angela let out a low whistle when I showed her the brochures. She's good. I'll give her that. Not good enough, I said, my jaw tightening. I made a quick call to Drew, explaining what I'd found. Track every property Megan's tied to, I told him. I want a list of her investors, her transactions, everything. By evening, Drew had already uncovered the first crack in her facade. One of Megan's largest investors, a corporate executive named Henry Ward, had unknowingly funneled money into her business under the assumption that the properties she listed were legitimately hers. The cabin, the house, all of it was part of a portfolio Megan had fabricated. And Jason? He'd signed off on the paperwork, guaranteeing the deals with joint funds from our account. That night, I confronted Jason again. He was in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, but the moment I walked in, he stiffened. We need to talk, I said, my voice calm but firm. He didn't respond, but I saw his jaw clench. I held up one of the brochures. How long were you planning on letting Megan use our lives as her personal resume? His eyes flicked to the brochure, then back to me. Where did you get that? Does it matter? I shot back. You've been lying to me, Jason. And not just to me, to everyone. Investors, family, banks. Do you even realize what kind of trouble you're in? I did it for us, he said suddenly, his voice breaking the tension. For you, Liv. I laughed bitterly. For me? That's rich. You did this for Megan, not me. You're her puppet, Jason, and you don't even see it. She needed my help, he argued. You don't understand how hard things have been for her. And what about me? I snapped. What about everything I've gone through? You think that justifies betraying me? He opened his mouth to respond, but couldn't seem to find the words. I shook my head, disgusted. You're pathetic, I said quietly, turning to leave. The next morning, everything came to a head. Drew's investigation had uncovered enough evidence to not only implicate Megan, but to potentially ruin her entire operation. Investors had already started pulling out, and one particularly angry client had sent a legal notice to her office. But it was Megan's next move that caught me off guard. She showed up at the house unannounced, flanked by two men in suits. She barged in, her eyes wild, waving a folder of papers in my face. You think you're so clever, she hissed. But you're not going to win this. I'll make sure of it. I stayed calm, refusing to be intimidated. Go ahead, I said evenly. Try me. Jason appeared in the doorway, his expression a mixture of shock and panic. Megan, what are you doing? Fixing your mess, she snapped at him, before turning back to me. You think you can just ruin my life and walk away? You've made a mistake, Liv. A big one. I met her glare head-on. The only mistake I made was trusting either of you, I said, my voice steady. But don't worry, Megan. I'm done making that mistake. She stormed out moments later, the men trailing behind her. Jason stood frozen, staring at the door as if expecting her to return. She's losing everything, he muttered, almost to himself. I looked at him, my expression cold. So are you. The fallout was swift and merciless. By the time Megan realized how deeply she was cornered, it was too late. Drew's evidence had been handed over to the investors, and Megan's little empire crumbled under the weight of lawsuits and public disgrace. Every connection she thought she'd cultivated turned cold, and she was left to face the consequences alone. Jason wasn't far behind. His name was now tied to the fraud, thanks to his signature on the documents Megan had used to build her scheme. He lost his job within a week, his boss citing irreparable damage to the company's reputation. When he confronted me, demanding to know how I could do this to him, I didn't flinch. I didn't ruin your life, Jason, I told him. You did that all on your own. You chose Megan over me. You chose greed over integrity. Now you get to live with the consequences. The legal process was exhausting but necessary. Frank, my lawyer, made sure I retained control of our home and a fair share of our remaining assets. Megan's fraudulent claims on the cabin were struck down, and Jason was forced to settle his debts. He moved out shortly after, leaving behind nothing but a handful of clothes and a lingering bitterness that I refused to carry for him. The first night alone in the house felt strange, quiet, but not empty. I sat in the living room with a glass of wine, staring at the walls that had once held so much love and trust. It hurt, knowing what I'd lost. But as the hours passed, that ache gave way to something else, a quiet strength. I realized that the house wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of everything I'd built, not with Jason, but for myself. The life I wanted didn't depend on anyone else's approval or validation. And for the first time in years, I felt free. Angela came over the next day, armed with pastries and a grin. So, she said, setting the box on the counter. What's next for you? I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. I don't know, I admitted. But that's the exciting part, isn't it? She raised her coffee in a toast. To starting over. To starting over, I echoed, clinking my mug against hers. The lesson I took from all of it wasn't about revenge or justice, though those things had their place. It was about knowing your worth. For years, I'd let myself be diminished, by Jason, by Megan, even by my own fears of not being enough. I'd let their voices drown out my own. But standing in the wreckage of their betrayal, I found clarity. The most powerful thing I could do was choose myself. Not in anger or spite, but in love for who I was and who I wanted to become. Life doesn't always hand you justice neatly wrapped in a bow. Sometimes, it demands that you fight for it. And in that fight, you discover your strength, not because of what you've lost, but because of what you've learned to protect. I didn't just survive their betrayal. I reclaimed my life. And for anyone reading this who feels trapped or overlooked, remember, your story doesn't end with their betrayal. It begins with your decision to rewrite it.